blows up in the 1980s, partly because of these new home technologies. I mentioned the increased marketing campaigns. This begins with the Star Wars films. Those of you alive at the time might remember how big the campaigns were for Ghostbusters were for Top Gun. It finally reaches its peak at the end of the 80s with the first Batman film in 1989, where you can't walk into any store in America without seeing Batman logos everywhere. That concept of mass marketing, of course, we still live with in American society today. So, you have new gadgets like this, which are totally changing Americans' relationships to things like movies and video games and marketing and advertising. Well, with Americans becoming more and more obsessed with movies and music and pop culture, you get a growing concern, especially in conservative America, that bad stuff is making its way into the hands of children. And this is corrupting America's children, and we have to find a way to stop this musical filth from making its way into the hands of America's children. That is where Tipper Gore, who was the wife of a major Democratic congressman at the time, anyone know who Tipper Gore? Yep. The wife of Al Gore, yes. Tipper Gore and a group of other congressmen get together and they said, from now on, if you are going to sell music, which might make its way into the hands of kids, this has to be blanketed all over it. Parental advisory, explicit content. Now, I have a couple funny comments about this. Any questions or thoughts before I tell you these? Yes?
If I remember correctly, did you even have to be an adult to buy it, even if it had that?
I think it depended on what store you were getting it from. I can tell you by the time I was really growing up at the end of the 90s, you did not have to be an adult to get your hands on this stuff. Yeah.
That label sold more.
That's what I was going to say too.
And
desirable.
That was one of the funny comments I was going to make. Some artists protested this label, not because they were particularly dirty artists. They said, no kid's going to want to buy my music if I don't have that on my label. So I'm going to have to dirty up my music now to sell more copies because they're going to view me as parent-friendly stuff otherwise. So there was some criticism. Do labels like these encourage the further degeneration of music into obscenity? Because kids want the hardcore stuff. Once again, still a debate we're having in American society. What exactly, if anything, is the best approach to keep obscene material from children? So, any questions or thoughts about that whole thing? Yes?
Tell them they have to watch it.
Tell them they have to. Yes, sir?
Obviously.
Yep. And that actually, believe me, I've heard parents say that today. If I don't want my kids to do something, I just tell them that they have to do it, and then, you know, it's over there. So, yeah, so, any other questions or thoughts about these new changes? So, as you're beginning to learn here, the 1980s are a pivotal decade for American culture. A lot of the aspects of daily life that you take for granted today really originated in the 1980s and just kind of grew their way up from there. Well, in the 1980s, I mentioned people generally felt good about themselves. They felt good about where America was headed, and you definitely see this in the culture of the time and in the politics of the time. Just a quick mention about these elections. You guys would learn more about these if you were in my modern American history classes, and I keep on selling my own classes there, I know that. But in the 1984 presidential election, the Democratic candidate Walter Mondale promised to undo the Reagan tax cuts for the practical reason he felt they were terrible for the long-term American budget. It turns out that that was not a good enough message to sell to the American people. Mondale was buried in 1984 in Reagan's re-election campaign. One of the biggest landslide elections in all of American history. Reagan won almost every state in the country. But even though this is a massive victory for the Republican Party and for Reagan in particular, there are hints of trouble to come in American politics in what you see in some of these growing ethnic and socioeconomic divisions in 1984. What do I mean by that? Even in this massive landslide in '84, you actually have fewer blacks and Hispanics voting for Ronald Reagan in 1984. Many of these more disadvantaged American groups felt that they were just not benefiting from this Reagan boom in the 1980s. And they felt kind of picked on, in particular with policies like the war on drugs. Also, Reagan refused to raise the minimum wage throughout the entire 1980s. It starts at $3.35 in 1981. It's still $3.35 an hour in 1989. So you get this growing belief amongst many of these groups in American society that these types of economic policies are not beneficial to them. And this is hints of future problems to come in American politics. To this day, you have serious political divisions between genders and between these different ethnicities in the United States. You start to see the hints of all of these, even in the landslide elections of the 1980s. Well, how does this go-go positive attitude of the 80s start to come to an end? Well, there are a series of both bad developments and political scandals at the end of the 1980s which somewhat dent the confidence of the American people. First of all, on the economic front, Wall Street sees a catastrophic crash in 1987. And there's an ugly scandal called the savings and loan scandal, which not only implicates big Wall Street guys, but also Republican and Democratic politicians who were in league with them. So this starts to cause a lot of Americans to question, are money and politics becoming too connected in American society? And is it a good idea to let Wall Street and big banks dictate American policy? Once again, those are economic debates we've never stopped having today. And then you have this, which kind of dented the positive image of the Reagan presidency. I heard an immediate reaction from you guys when this picture went up. Anyone under the age of 25 or so, probably who has not really studied history, probably does not know who this man is. The rest of you undoubtedly do. Who is this man right here? Oliver North. And what was the famous scandal that North was involved in here? The Iran-Contra scandal. Which, by the way, I can't give you all the details of this. This was a ridiculously complicated scandal which kind of spanned these different areas all over the globe. Long story short, North and a group of Reagan administration officials were caught going behind the backs of Congress, illegally selling arms to the Contras in Latin America, and doing this with payouts that they were using with the Iranians in the Middle East. So it's a long, complicated scandal, and North ends up going before Congress, taking the blame for this, saying, I did this, I'm proud of it, those Contras in Latin America were fighting against the Soviets, I was going to do whatever I could to support them, and he takes basically the blame, and if you want to use the credit for this. But Iran-Contra, though, other than its little intricacies, raises serious questions about presidential power. To what extent is the president allowed to go behind the back of Congress if he thinks they're doing the wrong thing? To what extent is the president allowed to engage in shady operations all over the world if he thinks he's doing it for a good cause? Many people in the 80s loved Reagan so much they felt he was justified in this. But this is also a major expansion of presidential power, which is beginning a trend which we're still living with today. President after president pushes the limits of presidential power, and people question, what limitations should there actually be on presidential power? Serious political questions like this are raised in the Iran-Contra scandal of the 1980s. And this dented a little bit the political legacy of Ronald Reagan. Once again, I know I couldn't go into all of that because I only have 15 minutes here. But did you guys have any questions or thoughts about that whole thing? Yes?
We're looking at child immigrants coming up from South America today because of the results of trashing oil workers down there at that time and forever since.
Yeah, and one of the things which if you guys, it's a really great topic if you want to study more on it, the history of American interactions in Latin America, there's a long and somewhat ugly history of American interventions in that area of the world, and it's caused kind of this anti-American feeling in many regions in Latin America, and it also has had serious economic implications on that region, and definitely many people feel that this pattern of interfering in Latin America in the 80s is a continuation of that. So, once again, that's a topic I encourage you to study more about if you're interested in that. So, any other questions or thoughts up to this point? Another thing I wanted to mention. Another kind of dent in these political policies of the 80s, one of the things Reagan was a lot at the beginning of his presidency was a borderline warmonger. Reagan was adamant that we need massive military force to deal with the Soviet Union. A huge nuclear buildup. The United States invests a massive amount of money and material in nuclear weapons again. And there's this increased arms race across the world as a result of these militarized policies. And Reagan often assured the American people, don't worry, we know what we're doing, the situation is under control. And it's kind of ironic, actually. This is kind of the law of unintended consequences here. One of the things you hear a lot, Reagan wins the Cold War. And that's partly because he so builds up America's military, the Soviet Union can't keep up, and he bankrupts the Soviets. That is true to some extent. But he built up the military because he thought the Soviet Union was stronger and more dangerous than ever. He actually had no idea the Soviet Union was about to collapse, that they could not handle this type of buildup. So there's a little bit of unintended consequences here. But what am I getting at with this particular military buildup here? I mentioned this faith in the American people, that the government knows what they're doing, and they know how to handle the modern technologies of the world. That kind of really shook this in 1986. And of course, what is that picture of right there? Challenger explosion. The Challenger explosion. It was seen by so many Americans, partly because almost every school across America was watching this for fun. Why were they watching this for fun? There was the first ever teacher who was going into space aboard the space shuttle. When the Challenger exploded in 1986, killing everyone on board, not only was this an incredible tragedy for the American people to live through, this was the 9/11 Kennedy assassination of its day. Everyone in the 1980s knew where they were when the Challenger exploded. Also, there's this new rattling, like, maybe we're not as in control of our technology and our resources as we think we are. If a horrible tragedy like this can still happen under the most basic of circumstances, what happens in the Soviet Union, who of course has all the same weapons we do, is even worse. This also happens in 1986. Chernobyl. Yeah, this horrible nuclear meltdown in Chernobyl, which not only poisons an entire area of the Soviet Union and kills thousands of people, it also, once again, shakes people's belief that we actually know what we're doing with this destructive nuclear technology. And there's this growing movement, especially across college campuses in the 80s, that we have to seriously, once again, change our thinking on nuclear weapons. The anti-nuclear movement becomes one of the major social causes of the 1980s. And it begins to have an effect when it brings two men together. This is a picture of one of these nuclear protests of the 1980s. This movement begins to have an effect when it brings two men together who in the beginning felt they could not be further apart. And you might recognize these two men right here. Now, who's that on the left-hand side? That's Reagan. Who's that on the right-hand side? Mikhail Gorbachev, Gorby as they call him. Mikhail Gorbachev, the new premier of the Soviet Union. He realized that the whole communist system was collapsing in on itself. And he also was deeply shaken by how ineffective the Soviet response was to Chernobyl. he started making serious peace overtures to the United States, saying that it was time to wind down the Cold War. It's kind of funny. In the beginning, all of Reagan's advisors were telling him, this has got to be some Soviet ploy. There's no way. No, we have to keep, we got it right where we want it. We have to keep up our billing. And Reagan really hesitates to talk to Gorbachev in the beginning. But eventually, these guys wear each other down. They sit down and have conferences together, and they realize that they actually have a lot of common ground here. At the end of the 1980s, you get a series of events which end up changing the nature of American foreign policy and also end up winding down the Cold War. First, they sign a series of anti-nuclear agreements which agree for the first time in decades to really seriously start to pare down the nuclear arsenals of the United States and the Soviet Union. And then you get the famous events of 1989, when the Soviet Union began to make it clear to the countries it was occupying in Eastern Europe. Those of you know what I'm talking about in terms of that Cold War reference. There were a line of nations in Eastern Europe that the Soviet Union had been occupying for decades. Gorbachev made it clear to them at the end of the 1980s they could no longer count on serious Soviet support. That was when you get 1989. And it's kind of funny. When you ask people, like how you feel about the future, how you feel about where we're going as a species, in modern history, the peak of the idea that everything's going to be all right was 1989. It's kind of just been all downhill from there. But it was in the year 1989 where the government of East Germany, which had long depended on support from the Soviet Union, they realized that without this Soviet support, they can no longer hold back the flow of people who are trying to escape that Iron Curtain. So the East German government announces randomly one day to people they're going to start letting more of them cross between that famous barrier, separating the free side of one city and the not free side of the city. What was that barrier right there? The Berlin Wall, separating those different areas of Berlin. The East German government is totally shocked when a crowd of people just swarm the wall. They ask Gorbachev to send in the Soviet tanks to deal with the situation. Gorbachev refuses to do so, and those people surround the wall, and then, of course, what do? They climb it and tear it down piece by piece. With the destruction of the Berlin Wall, this is the beginning of a chain event which ends the communist rule of all of these different nations of Eastern Europe. And the Soviet Union, within a couple of years, is in a state of total collapse. The Cold War ends with the final collapse of the Soviet Empire. And you get this new renewed feeling of optimism across the United States that maybe we are, in fact, entering a new glorious era of American history. Well, I'm going to start to wrap this up. Hold on a second. One final thing before I'll let you guys talk a little bit here. There was an election in 1988 between who was going to succeed Ronald Reagan. It was between Reagan's vice president and this relatively nondescript, dull Democratic candidate named Michael Dukakis. And Dukakis and the Republican candidate were running neck and neck for a long time. Does anyone know who Reagan's vice president was?
Bush.
The first George Bush, who assured the American people, read my lips, no new taxes. And they're running neck and neck in the polls. In order to defeat Dukakis, Bush initiates a really ugly negative campaign against him, which succeeds in ripping down Dukakis' image. It also, though, drives down voter turnout, which hits almost a record low in 1988. And with the end of the Reagan era, you get this new period where there's this growing cynicism in American politics that All of these politicians are worthless and corrupt, and no matter what we do, we can't change that. So even as you get these great positive political events at the end of the 1980s, you also have serious hints that the United States is going to be facing major struggles as we start to approach the 21st century. So that's my kind of brief rundown of the decade for you. I saw your hand was up, sir. Yes?
So one other major critical element of the fall of the Soviet Union is the drop in the oil price from $40 a barrel to $14 a barrel within a period of about 8 months. And since their economy was primarily based on exporting raw materials, like oil and gas, they ran out of money long before.
Yeah, there was a crash in oil prices in the 1980s, and in particular at the end. OPEC was upset that the world was starting to invest in renewable energy. OPEC, the main oil cartel of the Middle East. So they decided to immediately flood the market with cheap oil to convince people that wasn't necessary. It worked for a time, and we got cheap oil back. It also played a major role in crashing the economy of the Soviet Union. You're absolutely right about that. So,
interesting that today, that same drop in oil price.
Once again, the market was flooded with cheap oil. But yeah, alas, I'll have to leave that once again to you guys to discuss. Now, that's kind of my brief rundown of this decade. I did the best I could in an hour and 10 minutes. I wanted to leave the last few minutes for you guys to have any other questions or responses to some of the major topics that we've covered in this lecture. I mean, those of you who were alive in the 80s, you know, was there anything you wanted to add to what we've got, some of the things that we've talked about today? No?
About music.
We had Madonna. No?
Yes. What was the greatest music decade?
It was that. No.
No, it's not.
If you like hair metal and you like the keyboard synthesizer stuff, there was some good stuff that came out of the 80s. I, in particular, loved like U2 and REM and some of those guys, but I'm afraid the whole Jefferson Starship stuff I'm just not into. So, yeah, anyway.
That's 70s. That's 70s, yeah.
Okay.